Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day so far and welcome to the Immortal series. And today we are continuing with our Immortal saga with none other than Paul Morphy's game, which was played in 1857. So, well, we are looking at the board from black side because Paul Morphy is black and his opponent is a very famous player, Louis Paulsen, who is the inventor of the Sicilian Paulsen variation. And the game was played in 1857, as I said, in a first American Congress tournament. Okay, let's see how it continues. So Paulsen played pawn to e4, pawn to e5 by Morphy, knight to f3, knight to c6, all standard stuff, but knight to c3 and knight to f6. So the four knights opening, and bishop to b5. So the four knights of Louis.P now. Bishop to c5 by Paul Morphy, and castle by white, castle by black. All good so far. And here, Louis Paulsen went for this tactical operation with knight into e5. A very nice move actually. Even till this date, it's considered one of the best options that white has. Point being, after knight into e5, white has pawn to d4, double attack. So you are going to win your piece back. But in the process, you actually got the center pawn also on e5, and now your bishops are also open. But I mean, the theory has developed quite a lot. Let's say bishop to d6, and after, well, you don't even take this knight because if you take and play pawn to f4, then bishop into c3 followed by knight into e4. So after bishop to d6, white actually goes for pawn to f4, and some crazy stuff happen after knight g4, e5, and everything is hanging now. So I mean, theoretically it's still a draw, but everything is if you play it correctly. So, but in our game, after knight into e5, Paul Morphy decided to play rook to e8. A very nice move actually. But Paulsen played knight into c6 because knight was under attack. However, a better move would have been knight to f3. Just preserve this knight because it's a good defender of the king side, right? And this knight is not such a good defender. It's actually misplaced after knight into e4. Yes, black got its pawn back, but here let's see c3 followed by d4 next move. White is tiny bit better because this knight is kind of misplaced. Okay, but in our game, knight into c6 was played, and d into c6, of course, attacking the bishop, opening up this bishop in this long diagonal. And okay, bishop to c4 by Louis Paulsen. Still, till this point, this position has been played, but the move which Paul Morphy played in this position was never repeated again. And the move is pawn to b5. So it was in this position that this position was never repeated again. Okay, now bishop to b3 is one move, bishop to e2 is another move, and bishop to e2 was played in our game by Louis Paulsen. And okay, knight into e4, so winning the pawn back, but after knight takes, rook takes, here comes bishop to f3. Now if you move your rook somewhere funny, then bishop into c6 may come. So rook to e6, defending this pawn, and keeping this rook flexible so it can go to the king side if needed. Okay, now we have already seen how this pawn to c3 followed by pawn to d4 has been white's agenda all the time. So pawn to c3 was played, but this time actually it's a kind of a dubious move. So I want you to pause the video and try to find why this is a dubious move and try to find what Paul Morphy played here while I give you a couple of seconds. Okay. So the move in question is queen to d3. Congratulations to everyone who found this move. It's a very powerful positional move because see, c3 is the direct threat of d4, and if the d4 is executed, then white is simply better. But after queen to d3, you cannot really easily chase this queen away. If you play bishop e2, then the rook takes the bishop. Cannot really play bishop to e4 either. Cannot play queen to c2 either. So this queen is going to remain there. And if this queen remains here, then this bishop will be blocked in. So now black has some initiative in terms of activity. So let's see how the game continues. Paulsen played pawn to b4. Okay, nicely counter-attacking the bishop. Bishop to b6. and pawn to a4. So it's going all out in the queen side with on these pawns. So you don't really want your bishop to be trapped after pawn to a5. So Paul Morphy played b into a4. And this structure looks very ugly, but you have the dynamic advantage as black. So that's what Paul Morphy is aiming for. Queen into a4 by Paulsen. And inaccuracy by Paul Morphy, bishop to d7. Better move would have been bishop to b7 because then you will not allow queen to a6 defense. After bishop to d7, here white should have played this move queen to a6 when this queen is being chased, and if you move queen anywhere, let's say queen to g6, then pawn to d4 is executed. Let's say queen to g6, pawn to d4, and now this bishop comes to the game. So your dynamic advantage is gone, and now all these pawns are just weak. So you cannot do that, and if you exchange the pieces, well, you just exchange the pieces, and d4 is still on the cards next move. So it would actually be better for white had Paulsen found this queen to a6 idea. But okay, in our game after bishop to d7 inaccuracy, Paulsen played rook to a2. His idea is he wants to move this bishop and don't want to give up this pawn on d2, but it's a big mistake because now after rook to e8, there is a very direct threat which Paulsen may have already seen, and that's why he decided to change his move. So let's say white plays rook to a, let's say bishop to a3, which is white's main idea. Do you see the threat here? The threat is queen into f1. A very beautiful queen sacrifice, because after king takes f1, rook to e1 is actually checkmate. So that's the idea after rook a to e1. And queen into f1 is actually a direct threat now. Understandably, here Paulsen played queen to a6. So if you play queen into f1, then I just take back with the queen. But it's a mistake. It's actually a losing mistake. And this is where the magic happened. So pause the video. Try to find what Paul Morphy played in this position, which is absolute brilliant, while I give you a couple of seconds. Okay. Paul Morphy in this position played absolute brilliant queen takes bishop on f3. And what a move it is. It is such a nice move that later on after this game, actually William Stein is in one of his book, the modern chess instructor by Stein is actually made this position as a cover of his book. So an honor. But yeah, his position is just that beautiful. What else? You just lost a bishop and rook to g6 is coming. So you have to take the queen, which was played in the game. And rook to g6 check. Only move is king to h1. And here you have to see this beautiful move, bishop to h3. When black is just down a queen, yes, but these pieces are not contributing at all to this king. And yes, black is attacking without a queen right now. Okay, the threat is bishop to g2 check, which you cannot stop. In the game, rook to d1 was played. If you try to defend this position with rook to g1, it does not work because after rook takes g1, king takes g1 and rook to e1, queen has to block, and after rook takes f1, it's checkmate. However, the best defense would have been queen to d3, a very cunning move where you cannot play bishop to g2 check because after king g1, bishop takes f3 check, here comes queen into g6. And this beautiful resource actually gives white a winning game already. But after queen to d3, of course, Paul Morphy would have played pawn to f5, which he actually pointed out after the game that after queen d3, he has prepared pawn to f5, which is a brilliant move because it defends against queen into g6 and now threatens bishop g2, and you again has no defense against this. But it would have been the best defense. But in our game, rook to d1 was played. Okay, bishop to g2 check, king to g1, bishop takes f3, discover check. Your king only has one square, which is to go to this f1 square. So king to f1. And Later on, after this game, bishop to g2 check was played here, but later on, Zuckertort uh, pointed out that here, if Paul Morphy played rook to g2, then it's even faster checkmate. The line is you are going to take on f2 next move. Let's say bishop queen to d3, rook takes f2 check, king here, then rook g2 check, and well, it's a discover check. If you go to f1, then rook g1 is mate, and if you go to h1, then rook d1 is again actually checkmate because bishop defends the rook and it's a double check. So you cannot really take this rook. So that would have been faster checkmate. But it's one of the rare things that Paul Morphy didn't play. Bishop g2 check, king to g1. And again, Zuckertort actually pointed out in his notes that bishop e4 check would have forced the mate, and it's a beautiful variation. After king f1, there is this move, bishop f5, an absolute brilliant move, which Paul Morphy may have missed. Now bishop to h3 is the checkmating threat, and you cannot defend against it. You have to play queen e2 just to prolong one more move, and after this, rook to g1 is checkmate. So that bishop e4 would have been even better. But okay, after king to g1, Paul Morphy played bishop to h3, check, king to h1, and simply took the pawn on f2 with the threat of bishop to g2 checkmate. The only move to defend against bishop to g2 checkmate is queen to f1, so you have to give up the queen back. And Paul Morphy happily captured the queen. Rook takes f1 and rook to e2, simply putting the rook and defending the bishop and actually pinning the pawn again. So if you play pawn to d4, you lose that rook on a2. Okay. After rook to e2, rook to a1 played, so to unpin this pawn. But now comes rook to h6, a very strong move, because now there is this pressure on h2 pawn. I mean, everything is losing here. Louis Paulsen played pawn to d4, and for the last time in this game, pause the video and try to find what Paul Morphy played here while I give you a couple of seconds. Okay. Well, the rook is hanging, right? But you have to open the attack on the h2 rook. So just played bishop to e3, and it was in this position on move number 28 that Louis Paulsen resigned the game and Paul Morphy created this masterpiece. Well, you resign because if you take bishop takes e3, then after rook into h2 check, king g1 is forced and rook g2 is checkmate. And other than that, you cannot really defend against this checkmate. After bishop e3, you basically have to give up both rooks just to survive a checkmate after rook f2 or stuff like that. But we don't talk about this type of defense here. Yeah, that's the game. I hope you like this game and I hope you like this video. And yeah, I'll see you on the next video. Bye.